On episode 156 of the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast, we speak to executive coach Gordon Goldrich, and he's going to tell you how you can be a workplace warrior and not an abrasive bully. That's right, folks. It's all about striking the balance today. Are you ready for this? All right, let's do it. Welcome to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. This is your host, Scott McCarthy, and welcome to the weekly podcast where we focus on the three domains of leadership. Leading yourself so that you can be the best leader possible. Leading your team so you can build those high-performing teams. And leading your organization so you can drive that organizational output through the roof. Here at this show, we go and speak to world-leading leadership experts across those three domains and unlock their secrets, their tips, their tricks, and everything else in between, while coupling it with my 20 years of military experience as a senior Army officer in the Canadian Armed Forces to bring you the most complete leadership podcast going. You can find out more, everything Moving Forward Leadership at movingforwardleadership.com. Now, let's get to the show. Yes, welcome one, welcome all to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. It's so great to have you here, especially today and talking about this topic and how to be a workplace warrior, but not an abrasive, I'm going to say it, asshole. Okay? So that is all about striking the balance, and this is the topics that we go into. We talk about what it is, the four different types of workplace leaders, how you can recognize whether or not you're a workplace warrior or a bully, different types of communication styles needed for your organization's culture, and how to deal with a supervisor who may be abrasive or a bully and not a leader. It's all about being a leader and not being that horrible boss that we talk about so much here at the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. And I'll tell you a little quick backstory on this before we hit play of the interview. And that is, I actually got Jordan's book without it being pitched to me. It just was sent to me from his publicist directly to me without anything other than, hey, I think you'd like this. And as soon as I opened up the package and I looked at the cover and the title, and they say, don't judge a book by its cover. Well, I judged a book by its cover, and I tell you, I was not disappointed when I went through it. It is exactly what I thought it was going to be and what is needed for this show. Why? Because we are all about being leaders and not being those horrible bosses. And that's what he talks about. So this is an outstanding interview. And finally, one last thing before I do hit play on that interview is that we do have a survey going on right now. So all I'm asking is for you to take 2 minutes out of your time to fill out a survey to potentially win a book of your choosing, which I will ship to you for free. And it's basically to help me to help you with this podcast and do better. Okay? It's all about making the show better. There are already some changes literally right around the corner from us right now, from the show, which I'm excited about, but I need to do more. I want to do more. And it could be as simple as, you love the show the way it is, but I need to know that. So all I need you to do is go to movingforwardleadership.com/survey and tell me what you think. Tell me what is in your heart when it comes to this podcast so that I can either not change something you'd want changed or change something that's eating at you, that annoys the crap out of you, that you wish I just would change. But again, I don't know what I don't know. I'm trying to eliminate the blind spots, and that's why you come in with 2 minutes of your time. Okay? 2 minutes of your time will help hours of work on my end. All right, folks, again, that's movingforwardleadership.com/survey. All right, that's enough for me. Are you ready for this? Let's dive into it. So sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Jordan Goldrich and how you can be a workplace warrior. Jordan, welcome to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. So great to have you here today.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. Thank you.
We are talking about your book, Workplace Warrior. What's this? Oh yeah, people skills for the no bullshit executive. As soon as I got this in the mail, I was hooked, and I assume
Thank you.
I assumed that was, the goal, right? Put that little hook out there and hopefully sink in some readers.
It was part of the goal. Where it came from really is that a lot of the thought leaders on leadership call executives who get considered abrasive or straightforward, they call them names like bully and jerk and certain body parts. And it really ticked me off, largely because I was one of those. And so I came up with what I thought was a more positive title. And yeah, there was a piece of it I got encouraged. At first it was, am I going to say no BS? And some people said, well, that's a lot more politically correct, and et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately I just decided to go for it.
Yeah. You know what? So I'm still serving Canadian military, still in the Canadian Army. So with that comes a very straight style, like tell it how it is, like this is it, this is what I need you to do, blah blah blah. And I feel like there's definitely a place for that style of leadership, but at the same time you can't be to the point where you're abrasive, right? And I felt that through the book, that was the difference you were trying to point out. It was like, no, this can actually work, however there is a fine line.
Yeah. And thank you. And one of the things that I didn't point out in the book, because it really became clear to me after I wrote the book, is that a big piece of it is cultural. So if you're in the military and everybody speaks like this, it's your culture, and it's not rude. I grew up in New York City in a New York City housing project in a family that was loud by even New York standards. And I have a business partner whose mother is Mexican and his father was Dutch, and he grew up in El Paso. And my wife recently said to me, I hear you and Eric talking on the phone, and I think that's it. Jordan's leaving the company. And I was like, nah, we're talking to each other. So part of it is cultural.
No, absolutely. So as we're beating around here, let's dive in hard. First off, I want to know the inspiration behind the book, because books like this always have a story behind them. So we talked about the little bit of behind the name before we record it. So let's talk about the name, but as well, let's talk about, the inspiration for you to decide one day you woke up and said, I'm going to write this book about this topic.
Yeah. So I got, I've always been sort of a very direct person. People have always considered that I was too direct and perhaps tactless. I want to say that I don't think I occasionally would use profanity, but I wasn't one of those people who went around the office cursing and that sort of thing. And I wasn't unprofessional. But I built a company. I was the chief operations officer of a company, which we built from 4 employees to 65 and sold to a large insurance company. And I wasn't bright enough to realize that my direct personality worked well in a fast-growing entrepreneurial firm, but wasn't going to work so well in a nonprofit insurance company that was highly hierarchical. And about 3 years into it, I got fired for mismanaging my budget. And the week after I got fired, I bumped into the woman from the finance department who'd been my consultant in a coffee shop. And she said, Jordan, I owe you an apology. And I said, really, why? And she said, well, you know how for the last 3 or 4 months, you've been telling me there's something wrong with your overhead, and I've been looking at you like I have no clue what you're talking about? And I said, yeah. And she said, and you know how you asked me for a breakdown of your budget at least twice, and I never gave it to you. And I said, yeah. And she said, well, I knew exactly what it was, but I was told by our boss that if I gave it to you, I'd lose my job. So, clearly I was set up. And I realized at that moment that I had a real opportunity to feel victimized for the next 20 years. I have to say on the side, I actually did consult an attorney, but decided not to go forward with that. But anyway, and I decided that I needed to do what I teach my clients to do when stuff like this happens, which is focus on what you controlled in the situation and treat it as a learning experience. And I had to admit that for most of my life, well, first of all, I had to admit that I knew she wanted more deference from me, but I had seen her do stuff like this before, and I just didn't have the energy to give it to her. I was also working 60, 80-hour weeks, and I didn't have a lot of time to calm myself down before everything that came out of my mouth. And so I also had to admit I'd been told before that I need to clean up my act. So I decided that I was going to make a commitment that I was going to stop. I was going to treat people respectfully, even when my brain was telling me they don't deserve it. And that changed my behavior significantly. But as I developed and became an executive coach, I realized that the same kind of rationalizations that I had in my head were the same that many people who are experienced as abrasive have. And the more I worked with them, the more I realized that they didn't want to hurt people, that it was partly cultural and it was partly a defensive reaction, that their self-esteem was very attached to success. And when things weren't going well, they kind of struck out. But it wasn't like they weren't bullies. They weren't nasty. They were just partly it was cultural and partly it was defensive. And I really wanted to get that message out there into the conversation about leadership. So that was kind of it.
I remember that story from the book, and I remember even thinking, "That's crap!" Like, what a bullshit reason to fire someone because of mismanagement of your budget. Like, I was like, "God, that just stinks." I could smell it like through the paper and the words myself.
Yeah, well,
I could even feel myself getting angry about it.
Well, at the time, I was, and
right.
But I must say that, really taking responsibility for your part of it really helps when you're feeling victimized and angry.
Right. So in your book, you talk about the workplace warrior, and really, let's dive into this now. So, what is the workplace warrior from your standpoint, and what kind of characteristics they have, and
sure,
who are they?
Yeah. So to put it in context, I talk about the no bullshit executive. And, as we were talking before the podcast, I came up with that title because I was kind of annoyed that a lot of the thought leaders on leadership call executives who are experienced as abrasive names like bully, jerk, and certain body parts. And I thought it was ironic, if not hypocritical, to call people demeaning names because you want them to be more respectful. But, these people are hard to deal with. I can be hard to deal with. So what I came up with the title, the no bullshit executive. And then I have 4 types underneath it. And the first type is the warrior. And the warrior is the master. The warrior, I have 2 images for the warrior. One of them, do you ever watch NCIS, the original with Gibbs?
Yeah.
And then NCIS Los Angeles with Hetty.
Yep.
Yeah, they've softened both of them over the years, but both of them were sort of my picture of the warrior. Completely straight, no bullshit. Just if you're saying something that doesn't make sense or you're not performing, they're in your face. But it's really about your performance. It's really, they really are not talking about your character or being demeaning. And I think they're really rare because most people are, being imperfect human beings, slip over into demeaning a little bit. But the workplace warrior is just, it's on goal, it's on drive, it's It's on performance all the time. And they do have just enough empathy so that if you need a little support, they'll give it to you.
Right. Yeah. I remember that as I was reading through. So that's the warrior. You mentioned there are 4 different types. Yeah. So what are the other 3? And,
well, I call this,
what makes up them?
I call the second type the scientist. Typically, they're engineers or other kind of technical folk. They're very analytic. Usually, they're very introverted, and what gets them in trouble is that they often work with people who need more social interaction. So being introverted, they may have 1 or 2 people in their life who they have personal relationships with, but they really don't want to discuss what did you do on the weekend at work. They want to get back in the puzzle and fix it. So people experience them as abrasive. Again, they're imperfect human beings just like all of us. So there may be a obnoxious thing that comes out of their mouth every now and again, but for the most part, it really is about figuring out that they have to be more social than they're comfortable with. The third type I call the abrasive executive, and that's the type I was. And typically for them, they're the ones who tend to be louder and more demonstrative. Typically, the issue with them is that it's partly cultural. Partly they come from loud families or they come from loud countries. But the other piece of it is that their self-esteem is so attached to success and mastery and getting the right results. And they're very, very driven, so that when things are not going well, they tend to experience it as they're being attacked and they strike out. Now, the people who experience the strikeout feel like they're being demeaned and disrespected. And so that's the third type. And then the last type I just referred to as the bully, and they probably come under the psychiatric description of either sociopath or psychopath. They either enjoy causing pain or they just want to get what they wanted, and they don't care if they cause pain. And those people are not coachable. But my experience is it's a small group.
Yeah, I've pictured. Well, no, let me rephrase. I've experienced enough of those. And that is part and parcel to the reason why this podcast exists.
Ah, interesting.
Because, yeah. But, yeah.
So is it okay for me to ask you your story behind that?
Well, yeah, simple. The tagline of the show is lead, don't boss.
Yes.
So I've had enough bosses who were bosses, vice leaders.
Yes.
So it was time for me to, expand my horizons, and what better way than find great, amazing people like yourself, Mark Devine, who we were talking about before we got on the show, and for me to suck the knowledge out of your guys' brains and the female ladies' brains too that were there. So that's a pretty much quick short answer to the story. But I'm interested now because we talked a bit about how we can be, straight shooters like myself. I'm a very straight shooter. I've been told that I have a direct communication method, which I don't think I come across as abrasive or bullying or anything like that. But I am, that warrior as you wrote in your book. And you go all the way to that bully, which you said is uncoachable. Now, how much of a fine line is it from being that workplace warrior and a bully? And how do leaders recognize which side of that line that they're on?
Oh, interesting. So again, it's cultural. If you're working in a manufacturing organization or you're working in, like an oil refinery, you're likely to be able to speak much more directly to people and be experienced as just talking than you are if you're working in a nonprofit for disabled children or in a healthcare organization. And so partly you have to be able to read the organization. You have to know what part of the country you're in. I born and raised in New York, as I said, and my first 12 years out of New York, I was in St. Louis, and boy, did I have to calm my act down. People really experienced me as difficult there. San Diego is a little bit more direct than St. Louis, but not that much. And people in New York now think I've lost my edge. So I really want to highlight it. It has to do with who who are you, who's the listener? The other piece is that there's you want to hear a piece of unusual communication theory?
Yeah, let's hear it.
So I got this. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I did a number of years of family therapy. And this theory, and by the way, this is the first time I've ever talked about this on a podcast. So this theory comes from family systems theory. And what it says is that communication has two parts. There's content and there's relationship. And so content's whatever you're talking about. Relationship is, there are only three possibilities. One possibility is one up, one down this way. So the speaker is one up, the listener is one down. The secondly is the speaker can approach the listener from the one down and speak one down, one up, or equal. And one of the things that I've discovered over the years is that if you approach people from the one down, which is I'm in service to you, that you can get away with a lot more than you can the other way. So if I were going to tell somebody that they're not performing, I could say, I wouldn't be doing my job I wouldn't be doing my job as manager. And part of my job is to support you in being successful if I didn't give you a piece of feedback. Is that okay? As opposed to, you did what? And so I have really worked at that over the years. I have I'm a member of an organization called the Association of Corporate Executive Coaches. And I'm going to give a call out to the founder and CEO of that organization, C.B. Bowman, who has become a really good colleague and friend. She's from the East Coast. And I was living out here and I was doing, she'd ask me a question. I'd say, well, I wouldn't be doing then she'd say to me, Jordan, will you just tell me what you think? So again, that's an example of the culture. But in terms of managers who have been abrasive, it's really helpful to talk about what is your intention for this communication, before you smack them in the head. And often if you talk about the intention, by the time you get to the feedback, you've calmed yourself down.
I like that. That actually makes a lot of sense, especially the beginning part. It goes back to knowing your audience, right?
Yes.
And how you communicate with your audience. And that's
Yes.
always been, rule number one of public speaking, whether that is with a large group or one-on-one. Know your audience. But the communication model that you just mentioned, that's interesting. And don't worry, you're not the first to say I've never said this on a podcast. I actually get that quite often here at Moving Forward Leadership. I'm not trying to pump myself up or anything. It's just, I guess I ask different questions. So
yes. Yeah.
But back to communication styles and that warrior mindset and a workplace warrior. So I liked what you were talking about with culture, and that's something we discuss here a lot at Moving Forward Leadership, because I find it such a integral part of being a leader and how we establish culture and all this stuff. But we have a different spin on it in that sometimes we come into an organization and we don't have the ability to influence culture. And maybe sometimes it's the background of the audience that we're speaking with.
Yes.
So in this scenario where we show up and we're a very, direct leadership style, and it's that culture that really doesn't, resonate with it. How can leaders go about, adjusting their style, or should they in the first place to meet that culture?
Sure. Good question. So when you talk about that, are you talking about a leader coming in and taking over in an organization that they're new to?
It could be, or maybe it's someone who's been brought in like in a consulting role.
Yeah.
And they have to do that. It could be either or, right?
Yeah. So one of my heroes is a strong word, but one of the people that I really respect is a guy named Marshall Goldsmith. And I have a chapter in my book where I talk about Marshall. and his technique, which is called feed forward. And Marshall basically, he comes at it from a slightly different angle, but he's saying the same thing. You got to figure out who's in your network and what they want. I like to talk about it as doing internal market research. So what feed forward is about is that you decide that you want to work on something, or you have a goal that you want to achieve. And you figure out who are the key stakeholders in the organization who are influenced by what I do. And you meet with them and you say, this is my goal, and I want to get your feedback. Do you think I'm working on the right thing? And if they say yes, then you say, well, what are the behaviors you'd want to see from me going forward? There's a book called The First 90 Days. And I'm just totally blocking on the author, but it's about you're coming in and taking over a new company. You're completely outside. And the author recommends that you interview everybody and you basically ask them questions about the past, present, and future. And you find out, essentially you don't do anything for 90 days until you find out what's going on in the company. And there's some other stuff. I've recommended that to a number of executives who have just assumed positions in new companies. So it's similar to Marshall's strategy. But that would be the big piece. One of the things that I do now, I think I haven't mentioned it, but I'm 68 years old and I've been dealing with my personality for my whole life. I now know that when I think out loud and I'm brainstorming, I sound like I'm telling people what to do. So in my family, the conversation in my family would be, I want to do this. And my father would say, well, you know what you ought to do? And my mother would go, no, that's not right. You ought to do this. And it would sound like we were fighting, but we weren't. We just, we could do that for an hour until we reached, So when I coach clients and we're brainstorming, what are the options for them? I always warn them before we go into it that I'm going to sound like I'm telling you what to do, and I'm not. I'm just brainstorming. So that is something that executives can do if they know. One of the things I did in my company was I realized that when I get pressured, I sound like I'm being disrespectful, and I told people, give me the timeout signal. And by the way, if you give me the timeout signal, I'm not promising you that I'm going to change, but I will promise you I will never punish you for that. And it was interesting. The professional staff never did it, but the administrative staff, would be. And it was a reminder that I need to manage my behavior. So
it's tough being alone as a leader. You're often in situations where you're not sure where to go. You're not sure what's the best decision. Yet, as Colin Powell once said, it's lonely at the top. And reality is, it takes time. Sure, you can read books and listen to podcasts such as this one, but nothing beats experience. But who has time for experience when you're at a situation right now that requires experience to lead yourself, your team, your organization through? That's where coaching comes in. You see, coaching enables you to unlock the experience in others. Right here, right now, you have 20 years of military service plus 150 plus episodes of interviews and topics and research sitting at your disposal. So what are you waiting for? Are you ready to level up your game, become that leader that you know you're meant to be? Are you ready to go to the next level? If so, drop me a line, scott@movingforwardleadership.com, or swing by the website and book a discovery call through movingforwardleadership.com/book. And let's get you moving in the right direction, leading better, leading more effectively today, right here, right now. Starting off with leading yourself And then let's focus on how you can build your high-performing team to drive your organization's output higher, faster, harder today. Not next week, not next month, but today. All right, folks, that's it. Now let's get back to the show. Really like that first part in the 90 days. I subscribe to the exact same thing. I've never read the Marshall's work, and whenever I take over a role, I tell my guys, first 3 months, I'm not making a change.
Yeah,
there will be no changes here, and in fact, I even go beyond it, and I give a couple people, basically I call it veto power. I'm like, hey, if I try to change something, you need to basically veto me.
Yes,
as support, because I need that check and balance. Because as a hard charging leader, I want to make things better, but at the same point, I need to make sure I understand why the things are the way they are.
Yes,
what's been done in the past, what impacts will be occur if I make any changes to whatever problem I see going on. And hence why I use the 90-day model.
Right.
But I found it interesting that there was someone out there who came up with that and is, it's titled and all this stuff. And this is just something I've come up with on my own.
Yeah. Interesting. Very nice. Very nice.
Yeah. So, but as well, the thinking out loud part, I almost need to get you on a call with my wife, because that's exactly how she problem solves in her head, is by thinking out loud. Whereas I'm actually more of an internalist, where I'll think about it inside my head, not talk about it, because talking out loud to me is actually, to me, like telling people what to do. Right.
Exactly. So what you're identifying is a key issue between introverts and extroverts. Extroverts think out loud and introverts go internal. And extroverts, when they meet somebody like you and you go internal and start thinking, they're thinking like, will you just tell me the truth? They're thinking like you're trying to come up with a politically correct answer. And no, I'm just thinking about it. Whereas you have to put up with people like me that I just start. By the way, that's another thing extroverts can do that I've learned to do, which is if somebody asks me a question, I know that the first 3 or 4 things out of my mouth are not going to be right because I haven't thought it through. And so I say to them, I haven't had a chance to think this through. So what you're going to get is thinking out loud. Is that okay with you? And they'll say yes. And usually, I actually sometimes give them the opportunity. I could come back later after I've thought this through, and usually they say, no, tell me. So I say, well, the first thing that comes to my mind is this. And then the next thing that comes to my mind is that's not right because of this. And then the third thing that comes to mind, usually by the 4th or 5th sentence, I figured out what the issue is and what I want to say. But you can say almost anything you want to anybody if you put the right frame around it. So that's the key issue.
No, that makes sense. So we've talked a lot about leaders who are direct communicators, who come off a bit abrasive, how to harness that, how to use that, how to identify different things. I want to flip the coin now and talk to a leader who is working for someone who for them comes across as that abrasive leader, as that, bully or whatever. What advice do you have for them?
So, by the way, I'll admit it. I can't remember everything. So I have my list of what the advice is in front of me over here. First of all, think of yourself as a target rather than as a victim. So if I'm shooting stuff at you that's disrespectful or nasty, it's very important that you get to the point where you're not evaluating yourself based on how others talk to you. And by the way I'm talking to you or anybody else is talking to you is about them, not about you. Even if you made a mistake and you blew it, there are some people who are going to be compassionate and other people who are going to not be. So it really is about them and their style and what's going on in their head. And so that hopefully that you can, even though you may even feel guilty for what you did, or you may feel badly for what you did, don't take it personally, because you've got to be able to live with the fact that you're not a perfect human being. And the next piece is understand how their brains are wired and why they're reacting the way they are. Again, most executives who are nasty and experienced as bullies don't want to hurt people. They're basically upset and acting the way they are because either they're incredibly stressed, or their self-esteem has been threatened. It's almost like you held a knife to their throat and you're threatening their life. And what we know now in neuropsychology, neuroscience, is that threats to your self-esteem create the same kind of physiological response as physical threat. And so, understand that. If you can appreciate the fact that they have a warrior spirit, that would be nice to do. And let's say you really are hanging out with one of those nasty ones who just enjoys hurting you. I'd suggest you figure out your career options. Check it out. If you decide to stay and you're choosing to stay, your emotional reaction to their behavior is going to be very different than if you're feeling stuck and trapped. So you don't have to leave, but you have to know that you can leave. Depending on the country you're in, you might want to explore, and if you're in the United States, explore your legal options and have a conversation with human resources. Perhaps. I'm not suggesting that you start suing people, but it's nice to know that if the other person's behavior has crossed the line, it's nice to know that you have you have something in your pocket that'll help you out. Get a consultant, a mentor, a coach, and find somebody who in the organization seems to handle that person better. And ask them, how do you do that? How can, this person starts yelling at you and, cursing and blah, blah, blah. And you're just so calm. It just doesn't seem to bother you. What's your, it's not about what do they say. It's about what's their mindset. How do they interpret that, and find out how they're thinking about it. So, and then I guess the last thing would be to cultivate compassion for people that your brain doesn't think deserve it. So one of the, I took some training called compassion cultivation training. It was developed at Stanford, and it's about developing compassion for self and others. And compassion does not mean letting people off the hook. Compassion means recognizing that somebody else is suffering, even if they're behaving badly, and doing something to resolve it. So, or to alleviate it if you can. And so I'm realizing I'm talking a lot. There's a lot of stuff here, but if you want to interrupt me anytime.
No, it's good.
Okay.
You're the guest here. This is all about you. I'm sitting and listening, very attentively, actually.
Yeah. So when people, there are people that for every other person, it's difficult to have compassion for. So for everybody, there are certain people that it's real easy. You know they're suffering. Like I have a friend who is really annoying at times to some people, and just doesn't annoy me. I have no trouble developing, having compassion. Other people just trigger me, and I really got to bite my tongue. So normally I'll ask myself, well, what are they suffering from? I'll give you an example. I have a client who was working for a company, and he was very direct like I am. And he was working for a boss who was very dishonest and very difficult. And we talked about compassion. He calls me up from the airport. He says, I'm on the way to China, and I'll be there for a week, but the flight will take, I think it was 2 days. And he said, if I call him up when I get off the plane and say what I'm thinking, I'm going to lose my job. So I need your help not to lose my job. So I said, so what do you think he's suffering from? And the most he could come up with is being a narcissistic asshole. And so, and he couldn't come up with anything better than that. So I said, well, how about on the plane, wish him to be free from being a narcissistic asshole and send out positive vibes, understand that he's suffering, even if he doesn't think he is. And he called me up 3 or 4 days later and he said, well, I didn't call him up. It helped, but I still can't stand them. But you get the feel. It's figure out what they're suffering from.
What I liked about everything you said there was basically don't subscribe to the victim mindset, i.e., woe is me, this sucks, I can't do anything, I work for a jerk, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Take the proactive approach. Do something about it, whether that's talking to people, finding people who can deal with this supervisor of yours, figuring out what type of personality they are, how you can feed that. Maybe they are egocentric. Well, how do you stroke their ego to basically get what you need to get from them?
Yeah.
And, and everything else in between that you said, including go look for something else to do, because, it's not worth being miserable every day, because we spend a third of our lives at work.
Right.
Average work day is 8 hours. If you're a normal person who gets 8 hours sleep, there's 8 hours gone there. That's a third of your day. There's
Absolutely.
8 left for everything else. So it's pointless to be miserable. And by the way, that 8 hours at work is going to bleed into the other 16.
Yes, it is.
All right. So take the proactive approach. Don't be a victim. Go out and find a solution to the problem.
Yes.
That's what I heard there.
Absolutely. We have real similar philosophies. Try to figure out what you control and work on that, as opposed to that they have to change.
Exactly. Yeah. Jordan, man, this has been a great conversation that we've been having, slowly winding down. Is there anything that we missed for the leaders out there who, realizing, maybe I'm a bit abrasive or a bit of a bully, or, my boss is totally one of these folks.
Yeah.
Any last bit of advice for them before we kind of start wrapping up?
Yeah, mostly people who are experienced as abrasive don't recognize what the impact is. And so for those of you who, and because they're in a position of power, nobody's going to tell them. So one of the signs might be that, you've been passed over promotion, or somebody, your boss has said, you really need to control your temper. Certainly if you have a tendency to blow up and use profanity and yell at people in public or slam doors and that sort of thing. In the book, there's a chapter, a sort of a self-test of what are all the things that I could look at. And then if we have time, I'd like to throw in one other thing for the people who are
absolutely
who are not victims, but targets. Just slipped into it. For people who are targets of that kind of behavior, and that is using the I'm in service to you position. So if somebody, your boss comes into your office and is saying to you, I want you to do this, and you absolutely know it's not going to work. One of the things you could do is you could say, is it okay if I ask you a bunch of questions, because I'm anticipating I'll get some pushback and I want to make sure I represent you. And so you keep them talking for a while. And if they haven't figured out as they're doing that this is not going to work, what you do is you say, okay, and you leave. And then you come back an hour or two later or a day later and you say, I wouldn't be doing my job serving you and the company if I didn't let you know I can see some ways this is really going to go wrong. Do you want to hear it? If they say no, leave and make a note on your little personal log that you tried to tell them and they said no. And but typically if they say no, they're back in your office an hour later or a day later going, well, what was it? So it's really that in service to you position, that context is very powerful, especially with somebody who is more powerful than you are. So I wanted to get that in.
Love it. That's fantastic. Great way to start wrapping up the show here. Before we do wrap up, I got a couple last questions for you. One, a question I asked all the guests here at Moving Forward Leadership. According to you, Jordan Goldrich, what makes a great leader?
So there are a couple of quotes. One is Gandhi's, which is, there go the people. I'm their leader. I have to get in front of them. I like that. General Schwarzkopf said, great leadership is about strategy and character. And if you have to be without one, be without the strategy. And one of my colleagues summed it up as credibility and caring. So credibility has two parts. One part is, do you know enough to be sitting at the seat talking with me, sitting at the table talking to me? And the other is, do you tell the truth? And the caring is about, do you care about yourself or do you care about the big picture and everyone else? So those would be sort of the great leadership things. And by the way, I was really glad that I listened to one of your other podcasts before coming on, so I knew that you asked everybody that question beforehand.
You've done your research, sir. Well done. Well done.
Research is good.
Final question is, you should know what's coming now. Then, where can people find you? How can they follow you? Where can they grab a copy of the book? It's all about you now.
Thank you. So my email is, my website is workplacewarriorinc.com. And that's a really good place to find me. They can find you can order the book if they're interested on the website. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I also have a podcast called Workplace Warrior: Drive Results Without Damaging Relationships. And in either way, you can get a hold of me through either of those two formats.
And for the listeners, always, it's easy for you. Just go to movingforleadership.com/156. Jordan, thanks again for coming out and talking about this great topic. And thanks again for a copy of your book. It's much appreciated.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation and I've really enjoyed your questions. So thank you very much.
And that's it for this episode today. And if you listened to it to this far, wow, you're a super fan. Thanks for listening. But before we close out, I got two things I wanted to let you know. First being, did you know that it's easy to share the Moving Forward Leadership podcast? You see, regardless of what app you're using to listen to this show right now, whether that's on your phone, be it Android or iOS, or it's on your computer through the website, there's a share button right there. So why don't you take a moment and share this episode? That's all I ask. Don't even care about a rating and review anymore, but rather I would you to share it with someone, because you know what? They'd probably get something out of this episode as well. And finally, if you really enjoy the podcast and you feel like throwing me a bone, well, I'm a borderline coffeeaholic. So how about you just buy me a cup of coffee? And you can easily do that with going to movingforwardleadership.com/coffee. And feel free to throw me $1 or $2 for a cup of coffee. I don't need anything fancy. Good old Tim Hortons here in Canada works just fine for me. But as always, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening. It's an honor to serve you day in, day out with this podcast. And as always, lead, don't boss. Thanks, and take care.